Okay, so I'm James Wynn. I'm an associate professor at Carnegie Mellon University.
And talk to me a little bit about some of your past and current research in the field.
So my original research for my dissertation was about Darwin, and I do work in rhetoric and mathematics. Rhetoric and mathematics is a non-existent field at the moment. I mean, there are a handful of papers that people have done that have been interested in mathematics. Mitch Reyes, I think he's at the university, Lewis and Clark University in Portland. He had an early piece, but my book that just came out is the only book-length treatment of mathematical rhetoric. So that's a field that I believe needs to get a lot more attention, particularly if you think about things like the current presidential election and Nate Silver's blog about the statistics and how that had a sort of profound effect on the public discussion about politics and about mathematics and its role in persuading the public to choose a candidate or not choose a candidate. And I think that there's so many important implications that we cannot look away from mathematics. We have to look at mathematics. We have to pay attention to that. Unfortunately, of course, most of the people that are in English departments that do rhetoric and communication are in them for a reason, because they like doing literature and they like doing communication studies and textual studies, and they're not really interested in mathematics. And in fact, that's as far away from their interest as you could probably go. So it's been very difficult to, I guess, support a body of work of people that do that kind of research. Yeah, so that's been something I'm not working on now, but it's always in the back of my head, and it's something actually that I plan on doing some work with, getting together an anthology and maybe getting that going as far as getting some rhetoric and mathematics stuff out there in the world. Absolutely. In my book, I look at several different ways in which mathematics is rhetorical, in science particularly. And one of the things that I noticed is that, for example, Charles Darwin, who was really making a very hard case, and he knew he was making a hard case, depended very, very heavily on mathematics to make his arguments or to develop warrants to support his arguments. So I was arguing in one chapter of my book about the ethos of precision and this notion that you could make it tough, you could have a very hard case to make to biologists, but if you could bring the sort of rigor and precision of mathematics along, that it would serve as an ethos to support this difficult argument that you have to make. So that's sort of one way of thinking about rhetoric and mathematics. The other thing that I talked about is sort of how social cultural values in a lot of ways really undergird certain kinds of mathematical argumentation. So Francis Galton, who's the father of eugenics, really tapped into this sort of Victorian belief or spirit that they needed to know what their place was in society. And the bell curve is a perfect mathematical way of organizing people and showing, well, a lot of people are like this, but then you have these extraordinary people that are at this end and these extraordinarily bad people that are on this end. So this notion that there's also that mathematics sort of taps in or can tap into social cultural beliefs, and then you can use these social cultural beliefs to persuade people to use mathematics, I think is also a really powerful way of thinking about rhetoric and mathematics and science. So that's my initial field of research. Right now I've started a new project about citizen science. So now I'm kind of interested in how the internet has changed the landscape for argument and rhetoric, and the role that the internet has played in sort of opening up science to the public, and then the sort of challenges that creates for governments, the challenges that creates for science, and vice versa, the way that science and the public can be brought closer together as a consequence of the internet and their ability to engage in science and do science and understand science in greater ways. So,
can you talk a bit about the paper you presented at RSA about the radiation tracking in Fukushima?
Oh yeah, so yeah, that's one of the cases that I've been working on. So there's a group it's kind of distributed between the United States and Japan called SafeCast. And this group what they've done is essentially decided that they are going to map the risk of radiation from the accident at Fukushima. So the government was providing information, but this group felt that they weren't providing enough information and the kinds of information that people really needed. And so one of the things they did was they created their own Geiger counters that they could strap to cars. They drove around, and then they took this information and they visualized it and put it up on the web. And as you can imagine, this created some problems for them with the government, although the government was sort of closed-mouthed about it a little bit. But it's a really interesting case because it shows how a group who's a citizen group can go from sort of being non-experts and making non-experts arguments to being experts and making expert arguments, and sort of how the whole process of doing the science, getting the data, thinking about, well, what is radiation, how do we measure it, really changed them and changed the way they could argue for themselves. So that's one of the cases that I've been working on. And of course, there's a whole issue of visualization, which is how that's changed over time from 3 Mile Island to Chernobyl to Fukushima, and the ways that the development of technology has enabled certain kinds of representations to exist that weren't possible before, changed the formats of representations of risk, but also allowed citizens to participate, which also invites new kinds of representations to be developed that weren't developed previously. So that's all part of the project. So it's visual rhetoric, it's rhetoric and public policy, it's rhetoric and participation of the public in science and the science's engagement with the public. So,
what drew you into researching rhetoric of science or the rhetoric of math more specifically?
I've always really been interested in science. And it's a very convoluted, I mean, it's a very, like, I don't know, it's one of those, well, I just decided to do it stories, which is, to some degree is somewhat unsatisfying, I think, to graduate students who learn about like how I ended up in this field. But I've always been interested in science. I was just never really good at mathematics. I love science, but I was never really good enough at the mathematics. So one of the reasons so I was thinking about doing something with biology because I felt like I had enough, I guess, intellectual chops to be able to do something with biology. And I started looking at the rhetoric work that's been done in biology, and I'm like, you know, they really don't pay attention to mathematics very much. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll just do something with biology and mathematics and rhetoric. Without much thinking that, well, you know, I don't really know any of the mathematics. So what I ended up doing is getting involved in this project. In fact, I told Jeannie Vannestock about it. I had said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And she kind of like did one of these, whoa, okay, great. But she was kind of surprised by it because I think it wasn't something that she figured someone's going to walk into her office and say, like, how about this great rhetoric, mathematics, and biology project? So I did a lot. I had to do a lot of self-teaching, which was very difficult. And there were many times when I just wanted to give up because it was such a intellectually challenging project to be able to like learn probability theory and learn about the history of probability theory so that I could understand what probability theory was like in the 19th century, which is the time when the pieces that I was looking at were being developed. So I really had to understand it. I mean, but I can say that by going at the mathematics from the back way, that is thinking about the way mathematics work in arguments and what the philosophy of the mathematics are, what the limitations and parameters of mathematics are, it actually made me a much smarter, savvier person when it comes to mathematics and looking at statistics. Because I took a biostatistics course at University of Maryland after I had started doing my research. And I noticed that the person teaching the class couldn't really answer some very fundamental questions that I could, because I had known the history and I had understood how it worked in debates and why people were developing these kind of mathematics. So I think it's really this sort of historical, contextual engagement that we have with these things that really allows us to understand them in a way that people that do them don't even understand them. And I think that that's fundamentally important. I mean, I think that's where we bring in our value as far as thinking about mathematics and science and so forth, because we know the history. And we understand the debates that go into developing these things. So we understand how they develop and what the problems are, the challenges are with them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a nice segue to the question of what does rhetoric add to studies of science and technology and medicine?
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that
Yeah.
a little more?
I mean, I think rhetoric can add a lot. I mean, one of the things that rhetoric is, so scientists are really focused on their research, on the sort of body of knowledge, the facts, the methods that they use to move forward with what they're doing. But what they don't think about is their own history, their own processes, their own, I guess, their own disputes with each other and how their work develops. So I think what rhetoric does is it gives more of a bird's eye view. It sort of gives a wider angle lens on what science does. And in doing that, you see all kinds of things that scientists themselves just don't see. They practice it every day, but they don't really understand, well, for example, the work that I did with rhetoric, mathematics, and biology, people just think, oh, math and science, they go together. Sure. And the argument I was trying to make in this book is that they don't, and really that there was a very long and contentious history that led to the development of biogenetics and statistical genetics. Like all of that developed as a consequence of a really big debate, and it just didn't happen overnight. And so scientists working in the field, I think, don't recognize that. But what's also interesting is I think when we do look at the history, we see that there are cycles of argument that repeat themselves again and again and again. So for example, when people are arguing about mathematics and science, one of the things they say is, well, look, we go out in the real world and we see these organisms living in these environments, and your mathematics is just pie in the sky stuff that doesn't really apply to this. That's all just logic and philosophy and very disconnected to the real world. So you continually have to overcome this barrier between the real world, real experience people and the sort of mathematical, logical, analytical, philosophical thinking. And so this same argument happens all the time, over and over again. So I think one of the things we recognize is that there are patterns of argument that emerge. And maybe by recognizing that and having a history of it, you could say, look, you guys are doing the same thing they did here. Here's how it resolved. Here are maybe some issues you want to talk about right now instead of fighting about this for the next 10 years. So maybe we can sort of facilitate science in that way as far as helping them move forward with debates and make transitions between different ways of, I guess, doing science or thinking about science.
So do you see your primary audience as scientists?
I wish my primary audience were scientists, and I try to engage with scientists by doing interviews, talking about my work. But unfortunately, that's not my primary audience, because the challenge of doing work in rhetoric of science, I think, is that you have to serve a lot of masters. And so I can write about science and these issues, but I also have to incorporate rhetorical theory and also talk about how rhetorical theory functions in these settings and or how what I'm looking at advances rhetorical theory. So there's this sort of rhetorical core to the work that, unless you're in the field, is not really that interesting. I mean, or maybe it would just take a long time for you to unpack that section, so it would be harder to sort of make that engagement. So I think that that's a real challenge for us, is that we want to, on the one hand, advance our own field, but on the other hand, make some recommendations. So I don't know if this means that we have to have, different kinds of places where we publish the work that we do, ones that are sort of more, that are less about the rhetoric and more about, how what we do can help move people forward with this. So it's a question of how far behind the scenes do we go with people when we talk about what we do? So I don't know if we have to, change the way that we're approaching this or not. But I mean, I'm definitely supportive of a rhetorical tradition, though, and advancing the tradition by looking at science. And this is what Jeannie Fahnestock talks about in her book. This is a book about using science to talk about rhetoric, and I think that there's as much value in that as the other way around. So,
and that is my next question, which is what is that added value? What can we learn about rhetorical theory by looking at science as a context and a practice?
Yeah. Well, so for example, right now the project that I'm working on with Safecast, I've been thinking about ethos of expertise, and it's actually a lot more complicated than it seems. And so I think one of the things that science does is it allows us to, by looking at actual cases and how science works in the real world, you see that, for example, the concept of ethos and expert ethos is a very complicated concept. Now, that's not in Aristotle, right? Aristotle talks about like phronesis, but he doesn't say, well, what's the range of things that could be included in phronesis, and how can we talk about phronesis? And so by looking at science, you say, well, yeah, there's different ways of thinking about expertise and about how the public has expertise and how scientists have expertise and what the range of expertise is. And I think this really opens up opportunities for rhetoric to expand in important ways so that it fits in real world situations, and also to expand the canon. So we can talk now about phronesis in a much more complex way than just saying, well, yeah, it's people that have a lot of experience, and then they can bring that experience to making political decisions or whatever. So I think it really can expand rhetoric in that way, because the real world is so much more complicated than the way Aristotle or Perlman or any of these people talk about it.
So what can you tell me about the history of ARST and your involvement with it?
Oh, okay. So I'm not sure if I can remember how long I've been coming to ARST for. I think I started in ARST maybe 2006 or so, maybe before that, I'm not sure. But I think the first ARST conference that I went to was in Chicago. And so I've been going for 6 or 7 years, and I think I've really seen a change in sort of the programmatics of ARST. There was one period, I think, when I first got there, that they were doing environmental rhetoric for a couple different years, and then it changed to something else, and then it changed back to something else. So I guess it's been my experience that it's kind of been all over the map, at least since I've been there. I haven't seen any sort of consistency as far as topics and themes, except for the fact that it has to involve science somehow. But that's been interesting for me, though, just to see how the field thinks of itself and what things people are interested in at different times. And I also probably has a lot to do with whoever's organizing it, right? Because it tends to go towards their interests or something like that. So,
are there any particularly memorable moments, exchanges, or events that stand out for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and because of talking with you and other people, I agree that this ARST has been a really great ARST, because it's one of the few moments where we've had that brings everybody together from the field. So it's a really rare chance to get an overview, which is something we don't always get, because the way that ARST works, some years some people go, some years other people go, and so you kind of get different flavors. And this year you kind of have all the flavors in the same place, which has been very wonderful to just sort of see the eclecticness of the field, but also to step back and say we are a discipline, we do certain kinds of things. This is where we're going. This is where we are. This is where we've been. And I think that's really important. And that's not something that happens. And this is the first meeting I've ever been to where that's happened. It's, of course, been written about. So there's lots of anthologies where they talk about, here's what I think about rhetoric of science and where it's going and so forth. But this is the first time I've actually been in the room with everybody and we've talked about it. So I think that's why I think this has probably been the most interesting and valuable ARST for me. Yeah.
So a number of people have talked about some of the resilient tensions and sticking points in the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine. For example, this sort of epistemic rhetorics upstream, the scientists talking to each other, versus public rhetorics downstream. Is that an interesting tension for you, or are there other tensions or intellectual sticking points in the rhetoric of science that you think are also interesting?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think the upstream, downstream thing is interesting. I mean, people fret about it a lot, and in my estimation, I think there's been, and this is, I think, something that Leah points out too, there's been sort of a tendency to be on the side of the grassroots organizations or other groups that are trying to push their ideas or beliefs up, and not as much sort of how science reacts to that and pushes down. And I understand that this is a notion that we want to have a countermodel to, public understanding of science, which is just educate them, they'll go along with us. So we want to complicate that notion, and I think that's been really important. But I also think we need to be a little bit more balanced in our consideration of these engagements. I think sometimes we've pushed so far to being on the side of the underdog, or which I think is not surprising, given that humanities tend to have that sort of critical element to it, which is always from the bottom up. It's never critical from the bottom down. It's always critical from the bottom up. And I think that I don't know, maybe it's now attention. I think before it wasn't attention. It was just sort of like, well, this is how we're going to think about things. But I think now people are pushing back a little bit and saying, no, we have to really think at how the scientists are thinking about this, how they engage with the public, how, what their strengths and weaknesses are in these kinds of engagements. And I really support that. I mean, I think we need a more balanced, a little bit of this and a little bit of that, instead of just mostly of this, almost none of that. Because we can't be afraid to engage with the institutions. I think one of the tensions that does exist, though, is that people are afraid that we're all of a sudden going to become like PR people for scientists to, quash the common man's disputes and problems with science, which I don't think we have to do. I mean, I think I use this term of marriage broker, which is a sort of third party of someone that sits in the middle. And I kind of like that model a little bit better myself, just because, you don't have to be on, it's not a, he said, she said. You could say, okay, well, he said this, she said this. What do you guys make of these things? How do you think this is going to help you get along, not get along? What might be some strategies for, working together? Do you fundamentally want to work together? Why? I mean, just getting to these more basic relationship issues, I think, is essential. And I think that's what we can do. But I think there's some tension about, we have to take I think it's uncomfortable to be in the middle, because then scientists don't like you, because you're also supporting the public, and the public doesn't like you because you're also supporting scientists. So I think it's very comfortable to be on the side of the public or be on the side of the scientist. But I think the fact is, to really serve both parties, we have to be in the middle. But I think that's a really tough position to be in. And I'm and maybe there's a tension there about that. I don't know.
But rhetoric's always occupied that middle ground.
I think we think so, but I'm not sure that that's true. Maybe that's the tension for me, is I don't think that's necessarily been true. If you think about the work, for example, of Fisher and other people, like, they're trying to create a new epistemic that can combat scientific epistemic. And it's sort of, it really is all from the bottom up. And so I didn't get the sense that he's being in the middle about anything. It's just us versus them, humanities versus science. I think we've gotten away from that, and I think that's very useful. And I'm hoping that sort of this more central epistemic kind of discussion will emerge. Yeah.
So, in our brief time remaining, can you talk a little bit about future directions for Rhetoric of Science, Technology, and Medicine?
Yeah.
Obviously, you...
I want to plug mathematics, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I have to plug mathematics, because I think it's impossible to not consider mathematics in politics and science and everything. Because, I mean, when it comes down, when the chips are down in these debates, it's about the data. It's about how you process the data. It's about the probability of things. I mean, these are such central issues in these debates that they have to be taken up, and they have to be taken up. The mathematics can't be black boxed. The mathematics has to be opened up, because it's inside the mathematics. It's in those sort of intricacies of the parameters of probability theory where you get sort of the issues. And if you don't open these things up, you don't see those things. Or you get a very just sort of surface treatment of these debates. So I think that mathematics has to be opened up a lot. And I also think that one of the problems of science these days is that the scientists just do these mathematical and statistical, so for example, they'll apply different strategies to statistics to get rid of biases, like biases and so forth. And it looks like magic to the public. It looks like the scientists are just doing whatever they want with the numbers. Like they're just like, oh, you don't like this? Haha. Now we have the right number. And that's not, but people don't understand that that's legitimate to do that. And I think there's numeracy, right? Is a huge problem for everybody. And it's a huge rhetorical problem. So I think that that's one of the things that we can really, that's one of the places that rhetoric of science can really go. If we add, maybe STEM with a double M, right? Mathematics and medicine at the end there. We could do that. But I think it's going to take people that are willing to take a risk. I mean, I took a risk. I was terrified, but it was a good risk. It was a worthy risk. So I think more people need to think about doing that. Or we just need to get mathematicians involved with this. But I think the feeling is that it's so much into philosophy and analytics that it is not rhetoric. But I think the more we can disabuse people, just like we disabuse people, that science was rhetorical, right? That took a while too. I think the same thing can happen with math, and I think that needs to happen. Yeah.
So finally, do you have any advice for young people getting into the field, graduate students or? Yeah,
don't be afraid. Just do it. Just find something you're interested in and go for it. But make sure that you sort of do your diligence and teach yourself what you need to know about the science. Don't black box the science. Don't black box the math. You got to know about those things, because if you don't, you're really not getting into the heart of some central issues that need to be opened up. Because if we don't open them up and share them and talk about them, mathematicians aren't going to do it. Scientists aren't going to do it. You have to open this box. And so that's why I think it's important to do your diligence. But don't be afraid. You can do it. I did it, and I'm horrible. I mean, I'm probably okay at math, but I'm not. I had no mathematical training. I got an F or a D in math, a calculus, in college. So if I can do it, you can do it. And that's my advice, is just, do something hard, but, make it work for you and learn something.